My classmate kept repeating everything that I say and made me look like I am the copycat, but her fake brilliance collapsed in front of the class. There was this girl, Haley, in my sociology class, who would literally repeat everything I said but louder, and 2 seconds later, I'd answer a question in class discussion and she'd immediately raise her hand and say the exact same thing with slightly different words like it was her original thought. "That's such a good point, Haley," the professor would say while I sat there in shock. She'd even copy my examples. When I mentioned my grandmother's immigration story to illustrate cultural adaptation, Haley suddenly had a grandmother with an identical immigration story. When I brought up my part-time job at a bookstore to discuss labor theory, Haley mysteriously also worked at a bookstore with the exact same experiences. She was smart about it, though. She'd sit behind me so I couldn't see her taking notes on everything I said. She'd wait just long enough that it didn't seem obvious. She'd add little phrases like, building on that thought, or to expand further before repeating my exact points. The professor loved her because she seemed so engaged and thoughtful. Our classmates thought Haley was brilliant. She was getting credit for every single idea that came out of my mouth. When I confronted her privately, she acted confused. "I don't know what you mean. Great minds think alike, I guess. Maybe you're just upset that someone else is also smart?" She started gaslighting me, telling people I was jealous of her academic success, that I was trying to claim her ideas as mine. The situation got worse during group projects. Haley would volunteer to present for our group, then present my research and analysis as her own work. When I'd object, she'd say, "We're a team. These are our collective ideas. Don't be so possessive." But when grades came back, she'd make sure the professor knew which parts were primarily her contribution, which were mysteriously all the parts I'd done. She befriended my study group and started showing up to our sessions. She'd sit silently while I explained concepts to others. Then the next day in class, she'd raise her hand and explain those exact concepts, word for word. The professor started calling her his star student. "Haley really understands this material on a deeper level," he'd say. I was getting B's on participation while she got A's for participating with my own thoughts. I tried recording our conversations to prove she was copying me, but she was too careful. She'd never directly copy me when we were alone, only in class where recording wasn't allowed. She'd even pretend to disagree with me in study groups, then present my argument as her own later. Other students started coming to her for help instead of me because they thought she was the smart one. Then came time for our final presentations. 20% of our grade. We had to present original research on a social phenomenon of our choice. I'd been working on mine about social media's impact on rural communities for 2 months. I'd done fieldwork in my hometown, interviewed 30 people, created original frameworks. I made the mistake of practicing my presentation in the library where Haley overheard. She signed up to present right before me. The day of presentations, Haley stood up and delivered my entire presentation. My research, my interviews, my frameworks. She'd even recreated my slides with slightly different colors. She talked about visiting her hometown, which she described exactly like mine. Interviewing people with the same demographics as my subjects. Discovering the same patterns I'd found. The class was mesmerized. The professor called it groundbreaking. I sat there frozen. When my turn came, I stood up with my identical presentation. The professor stopped me after 2 minutes. "This is obviously plagiarized from Haley. I'm very disappointed. Please see me after class." That's when I pulled out my laptop and showed him the metadata on my files. Created 2 months ago. Last modified dates showing steady work over time. Email exchanges with my interview subjects dated weeks before. Screenshots of my research database with timestamps. "Interesting," I said. "Now ask Haley to show you hers." Haley's face went white. She opened her laptop slowly. Her files were all created yesterday. The professor asked for her interview recordings. She didn't have any. Asked for her research notes. They didn't exist. Asked her to name even one person she'd interviewed. She couldn't. "Those files could be faked," she stammered. "Timestamps can be changed." That's when I played my ace. "Professor, remember 3 weeks ago when I came to your office hours? I asked you about methodology for rural interviews. Here's the email you sent me with suggestions." The professor pulled up his sent folder. There it was. An email to me about the exact research Haley had just presented. "Haley," he said slowly, "you never came to office hours. You never discussed this topic with me. How did you develop this research?" Haley just sat there staring at her laptop screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type anything. The professor waited. The whole class waited. I could hear someone cough in the back row. Haley opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. Her face was getting redder by the second. The professor leaned forward a bit, still waiting for an answer about how she developed the research she just presented. Haley looked at me, then back at the professor, then down at her laptop. She clicked through a few files but didn't say anything. The silence was so uncomfortable that I could feel people shifting in their seats. Someone's phone buzzed and the sound seemed super loud. Haley cleared her throat and started to say something about her methodology, but it came out all jumbled and didn't make sense. The professor's expression changed from patient to confused. He asked her to explain it more clearly. Haley stammered through another attempt, but she couldn't describe any actual research process because she hadn't done any. She kept using vague phrases like standard procedures and typical approaches without giving any real details. The professor wasn't buying it. He asked her again to name just one person she interviewed. One single person. Haley's mouth opened and closed a few times. She finally said something about protecting the privacy of her subjects. The professor nodded slowly and asked if she had their consent forms then, since those would have the names. Haley said she did, but they were at home. I felt this weird mix of anger and satisfaction building in my chest. I pulled up my research database on my laptop and turned the screen so the professor could see it. I told him I had my complete interview list right here with contact information and signed consent forms for all 30 people. I scrolled through the organized folders showing names, dates, locations, and scanned copies of every consent form. Each file had notes about the interview, timestamps, and even photos I took of the rural locations where I conducted the research. The professor leaned in to look at my screen. He scrolled through a few files himself. Then he looked at Haley and asked if she could show him anything similar. Haley's face went from red to almost purple. She clicked around on her laptop frantically. She pulled up a few documents, but they were just the slides from her presentation. No interview notes, no consent forms, no research database, nothing. The professor asked where her interview recordings were. Haley said her phone died and she lost them. He asked about backup copies. She said she forgot to make backups. He asked about her field notes. She said those were also on her phone. The excuses were getting weaker and weaker. I watched her scramble, and part of me felt bad, but mostly I just felt vindicated. The professor's face was getting harder to read. He asked Haley why she didn't mention losing all her research data before presenting. That seemed like a pretty big problem. Haley tried to claim her files were corrupted or lost in a computer crash. The professor asked when this crash happened. Haley said last week. He asked why she didn't tell him about losing weeks of research data. She didn't have an answer. He pointed out that if she lost all her data last week, she couldn't have created the presentation she just gave. Haley started talking faster, saying she remembered enough to recreate it, that she had a really good memory. But the professor wasn't accepting that. He asked how she remembered exact statistics and specific quotes from 30 interviews without any notes. Haley couldn't explain that either. She kept digging herself deeper with every answer. Other students were definitely picking up on what was happening now. I could see people exchanging looks. Some were leaning forward to hear better. The professor closed his laptop and stood up. He said he was dismissing class early. Everyone needed to leave except for Haley and me. We needed to stay behind. The classroom erupted in whispers as people started packing up their stuff. I felt everyone's eyes on us as they filed out. Some people looked confused. Others looked like they were starting to understand what was going on. A few people glanced at me with what looked like sympathy. Most just wanted to get out of the awkward situation. The door kept opening and closing as students left in small groups. Each time it opened, I could hear people talking in the hallway about what just happened. The room got quieter and quieter as more people left. Finally, the last student walked out and closed the door behind them. It was just me, Haley, and the professor in the empty classroom. The silence felt even heavier now. The professor walked back to his desk and sat on the edge of it. He looked at me and asked if I could show him my complete research file structure. I opened my laptop fully and pulled up the main folder. I had everything organized by date starting from 2 months ago. I showed him the first subfolder labeled Initial Planning with my research proposal, topic selection notes, and early brainstorming documents. All the files showed creation dates from early September. Then I showed him the interview prep folder with my question templates, consent form drafts, and scheduling emails. Those were from mid-September. I walked him through the fieldwork folder, which had 30 subfolders, one for each interview subject. Each subfolder contained the audio recording, transcript, consent form, and my analysis notes. The professor clicked through several of them randomly. Every file had clear timestamps showing when it was created and last modified. The dates showed steady progress over 8 weeks. I showed him my analysis folder with my coding spreadsheets, pattern identification documents, and framework development notes. Again, all the files showed dates spanning from late September through October. Finally, I showed him the presentation folder where I built my slides gradually over 2 weeks. The file history showed multiple saves and modifications as I refined my work. The professor spent several minutes clicking through everything. He checked the properties on random files. He opened some of the interview transcripts and read portions of them. He looked at the consent forms with signatures and dates. He examined the photos I took during fieldwork. Everything was real and documented and timestamped. Then he turned to Haley and asked to see her files. Haley opened her laptop with shaky hands. She pulled up a folder labeled Sociology Final Project. The professor asked her to show him the file properties. Every single file in her folder was created yesterday. The presentation slides created yesterday. The outline document created yesterday. A file called Research Notes that was mostly blank created yesterday. There was nothing older than 24 hours. The professor asked where her interview recordings were. Haley said they were on her phone, but it was dead. He asked if she could charge it. She said she forgot her charger. He asked if she had any backups anywhere else. She said no. He asked to see her research notes. She opened the file labeled Research Notes, but it only had a few bullet points that were clearly written after she heard my practice presentation. The professor asked her to name one person she interviewed. Just one name. Haley opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked at her laptop screen like the answer might appear there. She looked at me like I might help her somehow. She looked back at the professor. She finally said she couldn't remember right now because she was too stressed. The professor asked if she had any of their contact information. She said it was in her phone, which was dead. He asked if she emailed any of them. She said no, she called them. He asked how she found 30 people to interview. She said through friends and family, but couldn't name any of those friends or family members. The professor's whole expression changed. I watched his face go from confused to understanding to angry. His jaw got tight and his eyes got hard. He asked Haley directly if she stole my presentation. Haley started crying, actual tears running down her face. She said she didn't steal it. She was just inspired by my ideas. The professor asked what that meant. Haley said she heard me practicing in the library and thought my research was so good that she wanted to do something similar. She said she didn't have time to do her own research, so she just used mine as a template. She kept crying and saying she was sorry, that she was under so much pressure, that she didn't mean for it to go this far. I sat there feeling this surge of vindication mixed with anger. All semester, she'd been taking credit for my work, and now she was finally admitting it. But she was still trying to make it sound less bad than it was, calling it inspiration instead of theft, saying she used it as a template instead of admitting she copied everything word for word. The professor told her this wasn't inspiration or using a template. This was academic misconduct. She presented someone else's research as her own. That's plagiarism. He said he was required to report this to the department. Haley's crying got louder. She begged him not to report her. She said she was already struggling in her other classes and this would ruin everything. She said she made a mistake and she was sorry and it would never happen again. The professor shook his head. He told her that presenting someone else's research as her own wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A deliberate choice to steal intellectual property and deceive everyone. He said this wasn't just about one presentation. He asked her how many times she'd done this before. Haley didn't answer. She just kept crying and saying, "Please don't report me." The professor said he had no choice. Academic integrity was fundamental to education. If he didn't report this, he'd be failing in his responsibility as an educator. He turned to me and apologized. He said he should have recognized what was happening sooner. He'd been teaching for 15 years, and he felt embarrassed that he missed such an obvious pattern. He said my work was exceptional, and he wanted me to know that. He was going to file a formal report with the administration, but he was also going to submit my research for the departmental award. He thought it deserved recognition. Haley grabbed her laptop and rushed out of the classroom. The door slammed behind her, and the sound echoed in the sudden quiet. The professor turned to me and asked if this had been happening all semester. I nodded and told him yes, it started from the first week of class. I explained how she would sit behind me and take notes on everything I said during discussions. She would wait a few minutes and then repeat my exact points with slightly different words. The professor listened without interrupting while I described the pattern. I told him about the group projects where she presented my research as her own work. I mentioned how she joined my study group and copied the concepts I explained to other students. The professor's face changed as I talked. His eyebrows pulled together and his mouth got tight. He kept shaking his head slowly like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. When I finished explaining, he sat down at his desk and rubbed his forehead. He said he felt terrible for not noticing what was happening. He told me he'd been teaching for 15 years and should have recognized the signs. I watched him pull up his gradebook on his computer and scroll through the participation scores. He pointed at Haley's column of A grades and then at my column of B grades. He said he was going to review every single class session and adjust the grades to reflect what actually happened. He promised me that I would get credit for my own intellectual work. I thanked him and gathered my things to leave. My hands were shaking a little as I packed my laptop into my bag. The professor called after me and said I should expect to hear from the administration soon about the formal investigation. He said the department took academic misconduct very seriously and there would be consequences for Haley. I walked back to my dorm across campus. The afternoon sun felt too bright and I kept blinking against it. My legs felt weird and unstable like they might give out, but underneath the shakiness was this feeling of relief spreading through my chest. Someone finally believed me. Someone with authority had seen the evidence and understood what had been happening. I climbed the stairs to my floor and unlocked my room. My roommate was sitting at her desk doing homework. She took one look at my face and asked what happened. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on my bed. Then I told her everything from the beginning. I explained about Haley copying me all semester and how she stole my entire presentation. I showed her the metadata files in the email from the professor. I described Haley's face when she couldn't answer basic questions about her supposed research. My roommate's eyes got wider and wider as I talked. When I finished, she stood up and said that was the most messed up thing she'd ever heard. She grabbed her phone and started texting immediately. I asked who she was texting and she said our friend group needed to know about this. Within an hour, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages. People from my other classes were sending supportive texts saying they always thought I was smart. Some said they noticed Haley seemed to repeat things other students said, but never realized it was systematic theft. A few people apologized for not speaking up when they noticed something seemed off. One message stood out from the rest. Stefan Knox from my research methods class sent a long text saying he always thought something was weird about Haley. He wrote that he sat near both of us in discussions and noticed she would frantically write notes whenever I spoke. Then she would raise her hand right after and say basically the same thing. He said he assumed we were just on the same wavelength or something, but now he realized what was actually happening. Stefan offered to write a formal statement about what he witnessed if I needed it for the proceedings. I texted back immediately and said yes, that would be incredibly helpful. He replied that he would write it tonight and send it to me tomorrow. Having a witness who observed the pattern made me feel less crazy. It wasn't just my word against Haley's anymore. That evening, I was making dinner in the dorm kitchen when my phone buzzed with a new email. The sender was Autumn Callahan from the sociology department office. My stomach dropped as I opened it. The email was professional and brief. She wrote that the department had received a formal academic misconduct report regarding the presentation incident. She requested a meeting with me to discuss the situation and gather my account of what happened. The appointment was set for 2 days later at 10 in the morning. She asked me to bring any documentation or evidence I had related to the case. I forwarded the email to Stefan and asked if he could have his statement ready by then. He confirmed he would send it tomorrow morning. I spent the rest of the evening feeling nervous, but also determined. This was my chance to present everything clearly and make sure the administration understood the full scope of what Haley had done. The next day, I skipped my morning classes and spread everything out on my desk. I created a timeline document starting from the first week of class. I listed every instance I could remember of Haley copying my ideas with specific dates and topics. I attached screenshots of my research database with timestamps, showing when I created each file. I included the email exchange with the professor about interview methodology from 3 weeks ago. I added my interview recordings with clear dates and subject consent forms. Stefan's written statement arrived in my inbox around noon. He described sitting near us in class discussions and observing Haley's pattern of note-taking and immediate repetition. He included specific examples from at least 5 different class sessions with approximate dates. His statement was detailed and credible. I added it to my evidence folder and organized everything into a clear sequence. By late afternoon, I had a complete package showing the semester-long pattern of intellectual theft. My phone rang while I was reviewing the timeline one more time. It was Melanie Harper from my study group. Her voice sounded apologetic before she even said hello. She told me she was sorry for not speaking up sooner about what she noticed. I asked what she meant, and she explained that she saw Haley taking really detailed notes during our study sessions. Every time I explained a concept to the group, Haley would write furiously in her notebook. Melanie said she thought Haley was just being a thorough student who wanted to understand the material. She never realized Haley was collecting my explanations to present as her own ideas later. I told Melanie it wasn't her fault for not recognizing what was happening. Haley had been careful and strategic about hiding her theft. Melanie said she felt stupid for not seeing it, but she was glad the truth finally came out. Melanie kept talking, and her voice got quieter. She admitted that Haley would often approach her after study sessions and ask detailed questions about what I had said. Haley would claim she wanted to build on my ideas or explore them further. Melanie thought it was nice that Haley was so interested in collaborative learning. Now she understood that Haley was actually gathering material to copy and present as her own work in class. The pattern was so much bigger than just the presentation. It had been happening all semester in multiple contexts. I thanked Melanie for telling me this and asked if she would be willing to write a brief statement about what she observed. She agreed immediately and said she would email it to me by tonight. The night before my meeting with Autumn Callahan, I couldn't sleep well. I kept going over my timeline and evidence in my head. I practiced explaining what happened out loud to my empty room. I wanted to present the facts clearly without getting emotional or defensive. The evidence spoke for itself if I just laid it out in the right order. I rehearsed describing the pattern starting from small things in class discussions and building up to the presentation theft. I practiced staying calm when explaining how Haley gaslighted me and made other students think I was jealous. My roommate heard me talking to myself and poked her head in to ask if I was okay. I told her I was just preparing for tomorrow's meeting. She gave me a hug and said I was going to do great because I had the truth and the evidence on my side. The morning of my meeting with Autumn Callahan, I got to the administrative building 20 minutes early. I sat in the lobby organizing my folder one more time, making sure every document was in order. The evidence timeline started with class discussion notes from September and ended with yesterday's presentation disaster. I had screenshots, emails, file metadata, and written statements from Stefan and Melanie. Everything was printed and labeled with dates. The receptionist called my name at exactly 10 o'clock. I walked down the hallway to Autumn's office and knocked on the door. She opened it and shook my hand, then gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. Her office was small but organized, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a computer monitor on her desk. She pulled out a legal pad and a pen. I started at the beginning, explaining how Haley would repeat my points in class discussions just seconds after I spoke. Autumn wrote everything down, stopping me occasionally to ask for specific dates or examples. I showed her my notes from different class sessions where I had written down what I said, and then what Haley said right after. The similarity was obvious. Autumn asked me to describe how the pattern developed over the semester. I explained the study group situation, how Haley would sit silently while I explained concepts, and then present those same explanations in class the next day. I showed her Melanie's written statement confirming she had witnessed this behavior. Autumn nodded and made more notes. She asked about the group projects, and I described how Haley would volunteer to present my research as teamwork, then make sure the professor knew which parts were supposedly her contribution. I had emails showing my original research and the dates I completed each section. Autumn reviewed the metadata carefully, comparing the timestamps to when Haley claimed she had done the work. The presentation theft was the final section of my timeline. I walked Autumn through how I had been working on the rural communities research for 2 months. I showed her the interview recordings, the signed consent forms from my subjects, and the research database I had built. Then I showed her Haley's files, all created the day before the presentation. Autumn asked me to forward her the email exchange between me and the professor about methodology. I pulled it up on my phone and sent it right there. She read through it on her computer, checking the date stamp. The email was from 3 weeks ago, discussing the exact research topic Haley had presented as her own. Autumn leaned back in her chair and looked at the stack of evidence I had provided. She told me this was one of the most thoroughly documented cases she had seen. She explained that the department takes academic integrity very seriously because it undermines the entire educational system. Plagiarism and intellectual theft violate the core values of academic work. This situation would trigger a formal investigation. Haley would be contacted and given a chance to respond to the allegations, but the evidence I had provided was substantial. Autumn said the investigation would include reviewing both of our academic records, interviewing witnesses, and examining all the documentation. The process would take some time, but she would keep me informed of major developments. I asked what would happen to my grade for the presentation. Autumn assured me that my original work would be properly credited. She said the professor had already contacted her about submitting a revised grade that reflected my actual contribution. The failing mark I received for supposed plagiarism would be removed from my record entirely. My real presentation would be graded based on its actual merit. I felt relief wash over me. Autumn asked if I had any other questions about the process. I told her I was worried about retaliation, or Haley trying to make things worse for me. Autumn explained that any form of retaliation would be taken seriously and would result in additional consequences. She gave me her direct phone number and email, telling me to contact her immediately if Haley tried anything. The meeting lasted about 45 minutes. When I left Autumn's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted. Someone in authority finally believed me and was taking action. I walked across campus back to my dorm, replaying the meeting in my head. Autumn had been professional and thorough, asking good questions and really listening to my answers. 2 days later, I was in the library studying when Melanie texted me. She said Haley had been called in for a meeting with the administration. Other students had noticed Haley wasn't in any of her classes since the presentation incident. Someone from our sociology class told Melanie that Haley looked really upset when she left the administrative building yesterday. I didn't feel happy about Haley being upset, but I did feel validated that the investigation was moving forward. That evening, I got an email from the professor. He asked if I would be willing to present my research again for the class, this time with proper credit. He wanted the other students to see the real presentation and understand what had happened. He said it was important for the class to learn about academic integrity and see how original research should be conducted. I sat at my desk staring at the email for a few minutes. The idea of presenting again made me nervous. I would be the center of attention and everyone would know about the plagiarism situation. But I also wanted people to see my actual work and understand that I had been telling the truth all semester. I wrote back saying I would do it. The professor responded within an hour, thanking me and assuring me he would address the situation with the class appropriately before I presented. He scheduled my presentation for the next class session. I spent the evening reviewing my slides and practicing what I would say. My roommate listened to my practice run and said it sounded really good. The next class session felt different from the moment I walked in. Students were quieter than usual, and I could feel them watching me as I took my seat. Haley's empty chair behind me was obvious. The professor started class by making a brief statement about academic integrity. He talked about how universities are built on trust and honesty in intellectual work. He said that recently he had failed to recognize plagiarism when it occurred in our class. He took responsibility for not being more observant and said he was implementing new practices to better track individual contributions. He didn't name Haley, but everyone knew exactly who he meant. Several students glanced at her empty seat. The professor then introduced me and explained that I would be presenting the research that should have been properly credited the first time. I walked to the front of the classroom with my laptop and pulled up my slides. My hands were shaking slightly as I connected to the projector. I started my presentation explaining my research question about social media's impact on rural communities. I described my methodology, how I had interviewed 30 people in my hometown over several weeks. I showed examples of the questions I asked and the patterns I discovered in their responses. I explained my framework for analyzing how digital connectivity changes social relationships in small towns. The class response was completely different this time. Students actually listened and took notes instead of just sitting there politely. When I finished, several hands went up immediately. One student asked about my interview selection process. Another wanted to know more about the specific social media platforms I studied. A third asked how I ensured my interview subjects felt comfortable sharing honest responses. I answered each question, feeling more confident as I talked about the research I had actually done. After class ended, students came up to compliment my methodology and findings. One girl said my framework was really interesting and asked if I planned to continue this research. A guy from the back row said he never realized how much work went into original research. One classmate approached me specifically to apologize. She said she felt foolish for thinking Haley was the smart one all semester. She admitted she had even gone to Haley for help understanding concepts, not realizing Haley was just repeating what I had already explained. She looked genuinely embarrassed about not seeing what was happening right in front of her. I told her it wasn't her fault because Haley had been really careful about hiding what she was doing. Stefan caught up with me on the way out of the building. He said he was glad I stood up for myself and that the truth finally came out. Then he mentioned something that made me stop walking. He said he had heard rumors that Haley did something similar in another class last year. A student in his dorm had apparently complained about Haley copying their work, but that student didn't report it officially. They just dropped the class instead. Stefan wasn't sure if the rumors were true, but he thought I should know. That information stayed with me for the rest of the day. If Haley had copied someone else before, this wasn't just about me. This was a pattern. I sat in my dorm room that night with my laptop open, staring at the email draft to Autumn. I typed out what Stefan had told me about the rumors from last year. I explained that another student might have experienced the same thing, but didn't report it officially. I wrote that if there were previous incidents, the department should know this was ongoing behavior, not a one-time mistake. I read the email 3 times before hitting send. My finger hovered over the button for a few seconds, then I clicked it. Autumn's response came the next morning. She thanked me for the additional information and said she would look into any previous incidents as part of the investigation. Her email was professional, but I could tell she took this seriously. She wrote that if there was a pattern of behavior, it would strengthen the case that Haley's actions were intentional misconduct rather than a mistake or misunderstanding. She said this kind of information was exactly what the committee would need to see. I felt better knowing the investigation would be thorough. The days after that felt strange. I went to my other classes but kept thinking about what would happen next. I studied for exams and worked on papers for other courses. Life continued, but everything felt different now. I wondered what Haley was doing, if she was attending her classes or hiding in her room. Some students had started talking about what happened. I heard whispers in the hallway outside the sociology classroom. People looked at me differently now, like they were seeing me for the first time. A week after the presentation incident, I received an email from the department. The subject line said, "Academic Misconduct Hearing Notice," and my stomach dropped when I saw it. I opened the message and read through the formal language. The department was holding a hearing to review the case. I would need to present my evidence to a faculty committee. They would determine what consequences were appropriate for Haley. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from that day. I had time to prepare, but the reality of it hit me hard. This was really happening. That same afternoon, my academic advisor, Cormac Owens, sent me an email asking if we could meet. I went to his office the next day, feeling nervous about what he might say. Cormac was an older professor with gray hair and reading glasses that he wore on a chain around his neck. He had been my advisor since freshman year and always gave good advice. When I sat down in his office, he pulled out a folder with my name on it. He said he had heard about the situation and wanted to offer support. He asked me to walk him through everything that happened. I spent an hour telling Cormac the whole story. He listened carefully and took notes. When I finished, he asked to see my evidence. I showed him the file metadata, the email exchanges, the interview recordings, all of it. He reviewed everything methodically, asking questions about specific dates and details. He helped me organize my materials into a clear timeline that would be easy for the committee to follow. He suggested ways to present my statement that would be calm and factual rather than emotional. By the time I left his office, I felt more prepared. At our next meeting a few days later, Cormac told me something that made me feel better. He said that in his 15 years at the university, this was one of the most clear-cut cases of plagiarism he had ever seen. The documentation I had was exactly what the committee would need. He was confident they would rule in my favor based on the evidence. He said the timestamps alone proved my case, but the email correspondence with him and the interview recordings made it undeniable. He told me not to worry too much about the hearing itself, just present the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I expected. I woke up early and put on nice clothes, business casual like Cormac had suggested. I gathered all my materials into a folder and checked 3 times to make sure I had everything. The hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon in a conference room in the administration building. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting area outside. My hands were shaking slightly as I held my folder. At exactly 2, Autumn came out and invited me inside. The conference room had a long table with 3 faculty members sitting on one side. Autumn sat at the end of the table with a laptop. I sat on the other side, and Haley sat a few chairs down from me with a student advocate next to her. I didn't look at Haley directly, but I could feel her presence. The committee chair introduced everyone and explained the process. I would present my evidence first. Then Haley would respond. Then the committee would ask questions. I opened my folder and started with the timeline. I explained how I had been working on the research for 2 months. I showed the file creation dates and modification history. I walked through the email exchange with the professor about methodology. I played excerpts from my interview recordings. I kept my voice steady and stuck to the facts. When I finished, the committee turned to Haley. She cleared her throat and said she had been collaborating with me on the research. She claimed she didn't realize she needed to give explicit credit because she thought we were working together. One of the committee members stopped her and asked a direct question. If this was collaborative work, why didn't she have any research materials of her own? Where were her interview recordings, her field notes, her data analysis? Haley opened her laptop but didn't say anything for a long moment. She clicked through some folders but couldn't produce anything. The committee member asked again, more firmly this time. Haley's face turned red and she stammered something about organizing her files differently. The committee asked her to name even one person she had interviewed for this research. She couldn't. They asked her to describe her methodology. She gave vague answers that didn't match the specific approach I had used. Finally, she admitted that she may have relied too heavily on my work. The committee chair leaned forward and said that wasn't collaboration. That was theft of intellectual property. He said collaboration requires both parties to contribute and both parties to agree on shared credit. Taking someone else's research and presenting it as your own work is plagiarism, plain and simple. The hearing wrapped up with the committee saying they needed to discuss everything privately. Autumn told me I should expect their decision within 3 business days. She said I had presented my case very effectively and the evidence was clear. I gathered my folder and left the conference room. My legs felt wobbly as I walked down the hallway. I had done everything I could. Now I just had to wait. 2 days later, I was in my dorm room studying when the email came through. The subject line said, "Committee decision, academic misconduct case," and I opened it immediately. My eyes scanned the formal language until I found the important part. The committee had found Haley responsible for academic misconduct. She would receive a failing grade for the entire course. She was placed on academic probation for the remainder of her time at the university. She was required to complete mandatory ethics training before she could register for classes next semester. The decision also stated that my original research would be submitted for the departmental award as the professor had recommended. I read the email twice to make sure I understood it correctly. It was over. The system had actually worked. I read the email one more time just to be sure, then closed my laptop and sat there staring at the wall. My roommate knocked on the door frame and asked if I was okay. I told her about the decision, and she screamed so loud our neighbor banged on the wall. She grabbed my hands and started jumping up and down, saying she knew the truth would come out. I felt this weird mix of relief and exhaustion wash over me. The last few weeks had been so stressful that I hadn't realized how tense I'd been carrying myself until it was finally done. The committee had found Haley responsible for everything. She failed the course, got put on academic probation, and had to take ethics training. But the part that really got me was the line about submitting my research for the departmental award. The professor had recommended it even after everything that happened. I grabbed my phone and texted my mom about the decision. She called me back within 30 seconds, crying happy tears and saying she was so proud of me for standing up for myself. I hadn't told her how bad things had gotten because I didn't want her to worry. But now I could finally explain the whole situation. My phone started buzzing with messages from people in my class. Word had spread fast about the committee decision. Most of them were supportive, congratulating me and saying they were glad I got justice. A few people apologized for not speaking up sooner when they noticed something weird about Haley's behavior. One girl from my study group sent a long message admitting she'd had a similar thing happen to her in high school, but she never reported it because she thought no one would believe her. She said watching me go through the formal process made her realize she should have said something back then. Another classmate messaged saying his friend in a different department had ideas copied by someone else last year, but didn't think it was worth reporting. He thanked me for showing that the system actually works if you have the evidence. And I started thinking about all the messages and realized something important. By going through this whole process, documenting everything and taking it to the committee, I'd created a clear record of how to handle these situations. The department now had official documentation showing what academic misconduct looks like and how to prove it. Maybe that would make it easier for other students to come forward if something similar happened to them. They wouldn't have to wonder if anyone would take them seriously, or if they had enough proof. They could look at my case and see that the system does work when you follow the steps and gather the right evidence. The next morning, I checked my email and found a message from the professor. He apologized again for not catching the pattern sooner. He wrote that he felt terrible about giving Haley credit for my contributions all semester and not noticing what was happening right in front of him. He said he was implementing new practices in all his classes to better track individual contributions and prevent similar situations from happening again. He wanted to create a system where students documented their own ideas and contributions throughout the semester, not just for final projects. That way, if someone tried to copy, there would be a clear paper trail from the beginning. He also mentioned he was going to be more careful about calling on the same students repeatedly, and would make sure quieter students got equal recognition for their participation. Reading his email made me feel validated in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about me getting justice for what Haley did. The whole situation had actually changed how the professor approached his teaching. Maybe other students would benefit from that in the future. I wrote back thanking him for the apology and telling him I appreciated the changes he was making. I also mentioned that I was glad my research would be submitted for the departmental award because I'd worked really hard on it, and it meant a lot to have him recognize that. Stefan messaged me that afternoon asking if I wanted to grab coffee. We met at the campus coffee shop and he congratulated me on the committee decision. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He asked if I wanted to join his research group for next semester. He said they were working on a project about digital communication patterns, and they needed someone with strong methodology skills. He'd been impressed by how thorough my research was and how well I'd documented everything. I felt this rush of happiness hearing him say that. For months, I'd watched Haley get praised for my ideas and my work. People came to her for help instead of me because they thought she was the smart one. Now someone was recognizing my actual abilities and asking me to contribute to their project based on my real skills. I told Stefan I'd love to join his research group and asked when they met. He pulled out his phone and added me to their group chat right there. The other members started sending welcome messages immediately. One of them said she'd heard about what happened with Haley and respected how I'd handled it. Another said he was excited to work with someone who took research seriously. I left the coffee shop feeling like things were finally turning around. When I got back to my dorm, Melanie called me. She apologized again for not speaking up sooner about Haley's behavior in our study group. She said the group had talked about what happened and they all felt bad for not noticing the pattern. Then she asked if I'd be willing to stay in the study group. She said they'd discussed implementing better practices to make sure everyone's contributions were clearly attributed from now on. They wanted to start keeping notes about who explained which concepts and who came up with which ideas during study sessions. That way, if anyone ever tried to copy someone else's work, there would be documentation proving where the ideas came from. I thought about it for a minute. Part of me wanted to just quit the group and start fresh somewhere else. But the other members genuinely didn't realize what was happening. They'd been fooled just like the professor had been fooled. And now they were taking it seriously and trying to make changes so it wouldn't happen again. I told Melanie I'd stay in the study group. She sounded relieved and said they were meeting on Thursday if I wanted to come. I agreed, and we talked for a few more minutes about our upcoming assignments. After we hung up, I felt good about the decision. The study group had been helpful before Haley started showing up and copying everything I said. Now that she was gone and everyone knew what had happened, maybe things could go back to being actually useful. 3 weeks went by and I almost forgot about the whole situation. Classes continued, I went to Stefan's research group meetings, and the study group was actually productive again without Haley there. Then one day I walked into sociology class and the professor asked everyone to settle down because he had an announcement. He said the department had reviewed submissions for the annual research award and they'd selected a winner. My stomach dropped because I'd completely forgotten that my research had been submitted. The professor looked right at me and said my name. He announced that my paper on social media's impact on rural communities had won the departmental award. The class started clapping and several people turned around to look at me. I felt my face get hot, but I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. This time everyone knew it was genuinely my work being recognized. There was no confusion about who did the research or who deserved the credit. The professor walked over and handed me an envelope. He said the award came with a small scholarship and information about presenting at a regional undergraduate research conference. I thanked him and sat back down, still feeling kind of stunned. After class ended, multiple people came up to congratulate me. One guy said he'd always thought my contributions in class were smart, and he was glad I finally got proper recognition for my work. A girl I barely knew told me she was inspired by how I'd stood up for myself, and she hoped she'd have the same courage if something similar ever happened to her. That evening, I opened the envelope and read through the conference information. The Regional Undergraduate Research Conference happened every spring and brought together students from universities across 3 states. Award winners got automatic acceptance to present their research, and the registration fee was covered by the scholarship. I'd never presented at a real academic conference before. The idea was exciting and terrifying at the same time. I emailed Cormac to tell him about the award and ask for advice about the conference. He responded within an hour saying he was proud of me and would be happy to help me prepare. He suggested we meet that week to start working on my conference presentation and application materials. We set up a time, and I started feeling more confident about the whole thing. Cormac had been to tons of conferences and knew exactly what judges and audience members looked for in presentations. With his help, I could make sure my presentation was strong and professional. I heard through another student that Haley had withdrawn from the university. Apparently, she couldn't handle being on academic probation and having a failed course on her record. Someone said she was planning to start over at a community college somewhere else. Part of me felt relieved that I wouldn't have to worry about running into her on campus or sitting in another class with her. But another part of me felt kind of sad about the whole situation. She'd destroyed her own academic record by stealing my work instead of just doing her own. If she'd put half the energy into her own research that she put into copying mine, she probably would have done fine. Now she had to leave and start completely over somewhere new, and everyone here knew what she'd done. I wondered if she'd learned anything from this, or if she'd just try the same thing at her next school. I hoped she'd actually learned her lesson and would do her own work from now on, but I also knew that wasn't really my problem anymore. I'd done what I needed to do to protect my work and get justice. What Haley did next was up to her. The spring semester started, and I walked into the same professor's class feeling different from I had in the fall. I wasn't nervous about speaking up anymore or worried about someone stealing my ideas. The professor seemed different too. During the first discussion, when I raised my hand to answer a question, he wrote my name next to my contribution on the board. When another student expanded on my point, he drew an arrow and noted that it built on what I had said. He was making sure everyone could see who said what first. After class, he asked me to stay for a minute and told me he'd been thinking about what happened with Haley all winter break. He said he'd changed how he ran his classes because he never wanted to miss something like that again. I appreciated that he cared enough to make those changes, even though it couldn't fix what had already happened. 3 weeks into the semester, I got an email about the regional conference. The date was set for early April, and they needed my presentation title and abstract by the end of the month. I sat down with Cormac during his office hours, and we worked on making my research sound professional and interesting for an academic audience. He helped me cut down my abstract to exactly 200 words and suggested I emphasize the original framework I'd developed for analyzing social media impact in rural areas. When I submitted everything, Cormac told me he was excited to see how other professors would respond to my work. I tried not to get my hopes up too much, but I couldn't help feeling nervous and excited at the same time. The conference happened on a Saturday in early April at a university about 2 hours away. I drove there with Stefan because he was presenting research from his chemistry class. The conference center was huge and filled with students carrying poster boards and laptops. I found my assigned room and set up my presentation on the computer. There were maybe 30 people in the audience when I started talking. I explained my research on how social media affected small rural communities and showed my data about information access and social connection patterns. When I finished, several people raised their hands to ask questions. A professor from another university asked about my methodology and seemed impressed when I explained my interview process. Another professor asked if I'd considered applying to graduate programs because my research showed strong analytical skills. After the presentation ended, that same professor gave me her card and told me to email her if I wanted to talk about graduate school options in sociology. Walking out of that presentation room, I felt something click into place. I'd just presented my research to actual professors and graduate students, and they'd taken me seriously. They'd asked real questions and given me compliments about my work. Nobody had tried to take credit for my ideas, or make me feel like I wasn't smart enough. This was my research, and everyone in that room knew it. Stefan found me in the hallway afterward and said my presentation was really good. He'd snuck into the back of the room to watch, even though he was supposed to be at his own session. We grabbed lunch in the campus cafeteria and talked about how weird it felt to be treated like real researchers instead of just undergrads taking classes. I kept thinking about what that professor had said about graduate school. I'd never seriously considered it before because I'd spent so much time doubting whether I was actually good at research or if I'd just gotten lucky. But maybe I was actually good at this stuff. Maybe Haley stealing my work didn't mean I wasn't smart. It just meant she recognized that my work was worth stealing. Back on campus the following week, I got an email from Professor Simmons who taught Introduction to Sociology. She said she'd heard about my research from my professor and wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak to her class about undergraduate research opportunities. I agreed, and showed up the next Thursday to talk to a room full of freshmen and sophomores. I explained how I'd gotten interested in my research topic, and walked them through the process of developing a research question and collecting data. I talked about the conference and how exciting it was to present my work to other people in the field. Toward the end, I mentioned that it was important to document your work carefully and keep records of everything you do. I didn't say why exactly, but I hinted that it protected your ideas and made sure you got proper credit. After the talk ended, 3 students came up to ask me questions. One girl asked what to do if someone in her group project wasn't pulling their weight, but kept trying to take credit for other people's work. Another guy asked how to handle a situation where his lab partner kept copying his analysis without understanding it. I gave them advice about documenting contributions and talking to professors early before problems got worse. It felt strange to be the person other students came to for help with this stuff. Over the next few weeks, more students reached out to me through email or stopped me on campus. Word had gotten around that I'd dealt with someone plagiarizing my work and won. People wanted to know how I'd proven it and what happened to the other student. I tried to be helpful without going into too many details about Haley specifically. Then one afternoon, Autumn from the department office emailed me asking if I'd be willing to talk to another student who was experiencing something similar. She said the student was nervous about reporting it and wanted to hear from someone who'd been through the process. I met with the student at a coffee shop and listened to her describe how her roommate had been copying her assignments and turning them in for a different class. I told her about documenting everything and keeping time-stamped files. I explained how the hearing process worked and what kind of evidence the committee would want to see. She seemed relieved to talk to someone who understood what she was going through. After that meeting, I realized I'd accidentally become an unofficial resource for academic integrity issues. It wasn't something I'd planned, but it felt good to help other people avoid the frustration I'd experienced. By the end of spring semester, I'd started thinking seriously about continuing my research over the summer. The Rural Communities Project still had so many questions I wanted to explore. I looked into summer research fellowships and found one specifically for sociology students. The application required a research proposal and 2 faculty recommendation letters. I asked my professor and Cormac if they'd write letters for me. Both of them agreed immediately. My professor told me he'd emphasize my original contributions and strong analytical skills in his letter. Cormac said he'd focus on my dedication and ability to handle complex research projects. I spent 2 weeks writing my proposal and revising it until it explained exactly what I wanted to study and why it mattered. When I finally submitted the application in late April, I felt proud of what I'd put together. This was entirely my own work, and nobody could take credit for it but me. The acceptance email came in mid-May, right after finals ended. I'd gotten the fellowship. They were offering me funding for 10 weeks of research over the summer, plus money for materials and travel. The fellowship would lead directly into a senior thesis project next year. I read the email 3 times to make sure it was real. This opportunity existed because I'd stood up for my work instead of letting Haley keep stealing credit. If I'd stayed quiet and just accepted what was happening, I'd probably still be getting B's while someone else got praised for my ideas. Instead, I had a fellowship and a thesis project and professors who knew my work was genuinely mine. I called my mom to tell her the news and she got emotional on the phone. She said she was proud of me for fighting for what I deserved. That night, I sat in my dorm room thinking about everything that had happened since that presentation day back in December. The whole situation with Haley had been awful while it was happening, but it taught me that my ideas actually had value. I didn't have to doubt myself or let other people make me feel like I wasn't good enough. I had every right to protect my work and demand credit for what I created. Now, I was heading into my senior year with a research fellowship and real confidence in my abilities. I was excited to keep working on research that was completely and totally mine.